Good morning and welcome back to the GFS podcast. This is your host Nasha Vador, and continuing with last episode, we have today a very esteemed guest, Mr. Matthew Savage, who will also be talking to us about the male mental health and the male stigma as well. So, can we please give a warm welcome to Mr. Matthew Savage, who's going to be enriching us on today's episode.
My name is Matthew Savage and I'm an assessment, wellbeing and diversity and inclusion consultant. I used to be an international school principal for a number of years and now I work with schools across the globe, helping them to ensure that every child, without exception or condition, can be seen, be heard, be known and belong. And that puts at its centre well-being. And it's on the back of that I've been working with GEMS founders for the last 4 years, I think it is, 3 or 4 years now, as a partner kind of treading this road alongside the middle and senior leadership of the school. And it's a pleasure to be here with you in this podcast to explore some of these ideas further.
What motivates or inspires your commitment to the field of mental health, and why is promoting mental well-being important to you on a personal level?
I think I'm motivated to promote mental health and wellness for so many different reasons. I mean, there's that of my own personal story and the story of my children, and both they and I have navigated very complex mental health journeys over the years. So I think our own personal experience is always a motivator, isn't it, in determining what we're going to focus on in life, what we're going to be passionate about, what we want to change, right? But I also think we know there are manifold existential threats to the planet, to humankind, from so many different directions. And if we're to rise to the challenge of healing lots of that damage, we need to be resilient. Yeah. And I think that resilience is a word that is overused. You know, it's often asked by those in power of those without. But at its deepest sense, I suppose, I'm going to be resilient if I'm well, right? If I'm not well mentally, then I'm not going to be able to wrestle with the many challenges that life is going to throw at me, at my community, at the planet. And so I think that's another motivating factor for me. You know, your generation are the generation to whom we're handing this broken, bruised, bandaged planet. And you guys are the ones who now need to rescue it, who need to heal it. But if you're not well in yourself, then I think your ability to do that is massively diminished. So I think it arises from personal experience, which I'm sure we'll touch upon later, but also the desire to equip you to wrestle with the challenges that we are throwing your way.
What motivates or inspires your commitment to the field of mental health, and why is promoting mental well-being important to you on a personal level?
Again, in order for us to be well, we need to be nourished, right? In order for my physical self to be well, I need to be nourished with nourishing food, nourishing drink. I need to exercise healthily and well in order to get that nourishment. And I think in order to be mentally well, I also need nourishment. And some of that nourishment is going to come from within me, from my mindful, wise self. But some of that nourishment is going to come from without. It's going to come from my friends, my peer group. It's going to come from my teachers. It's going to come from my familial relationships. And there's a strong sense, I think, increasingly, that I am well if we are well. If I'm part of a community which is well, which is mentally healthy as a community, then as part of that community, I'm far more likely to be well myself. And then there's also the element of empathy and interrelationship, whereby if I notice that you are not well, I'm attuned to that, I'm tuned into that frequency, then I'm more able to help you, and vice versa. So I think the more isolated we are, the less well we're going to be. We're social animals. We need to be part of a community. We need to be part of a safe community. But in that sense also, a bad family or a bad peer group can be one of the biggest threats to my wellness, to my mental health. If my family environment is not safe, if it's conditional, if it's not nurturing, if it's not nourishing, it can actually be the opposite of those things. It can be toxin rather than giving me nutrients. It's giving me toxins, and so it can work both ways.
What role do relationships, including friendships and family connections, play in supporting a person's mental health journey?
Well, first of all, we need to know. We need to know whether you're okay. Epistemologically, we need to be critical in our interrogation of our ability to know. So I, as a teacher, might proudly say to myself, my class, they're all great. My class are all happy. My class are all okay, right? But how do I know? So one of the first steps to supporting and promoting positive well-being and mental health with students and indeed with staff is to make sure that I know, and that comes down to measurement. And there are so many ways in which we can measure well-being. A lot of my job is helping the schools to measure well-being in lots of different nuanced ways, qualitative ways, quantitative ways, seeing how all of those different measurement points can interrelate, or rather do interrelate, and me interpreting and reading all of those interrelated data points enables me better to know whether you're okay, to know what your challenges are, and then to act on it. Now, if a school measures well-being, but nothing gets better, if I measure your well-being and then I don't support you, I think there's almost a cruelty in that. To give you that hope that we're listening, to give you that hope that we're gonna act, and then we don't, is I think almost worse than not asking you and not measuring in the first place. So firstly, we need to measure, we need to know, and secondly, we need to act upon that knowledge. A simple definition for me of just good teaching is how well do I know the child beneath the manifold masks that they wear, and how well do I use that knowledge to make their lives better, right? And that's what I'm talking about here. If I really simplify it though, how do schools best support individuals with their mental health? It's through connection. It's through relationships. If in a school I have positive relationships with my teachers, and I believe and know and trust that my teachers like me, that my teachers are genuinely curious and genuinely curious about me, that they care. It's from the soil of those strong symbiotic relationships that much of positive mental health will then grow. So I think it's about measuring and knowing, first of all, having the humility to know that I probably don't know unless I find new nuanced ways to know. It's acting on that knowledge, and it's remembering that relationships are everything.
In what ways do you think schools can better support individuals with promoting and supporting their mental health?
Well, I think there are so many stigmas, aren't there? And there are so many misconceptions, and I could answer this question for hours, which is probably not the level of conciseness that you want within an interview like this. I think there's a big myth. I touched on it in an earlier answer. I think there's a big myth around resilience. And I think often it can come from an older generation to a younger. I often hear adults say, kids are not as resilient as we were. Back when I was at school, we were more resilient. And so I think there is a resilience myth. Because I happen to think that the generation to which you guys belong is more resilient than ever that's come before it. Because the challenges with which you are being presented, generally manufactured by us, are bigger than any that have been faced before. So there are big myths, I think, around resilience. There are myths around what is called growth mindset. The idea was developed by someone called Carol Dweck, and in her early writing about growth mindset, it's hard to disagree with it. But that's, I think, been contorted and twisted over the years to become almost a tool of oppression, telling you as students, as children, as young people, you can always do better, you can always be better. And I think that's really oppressive, because that robs you of the inalienable right to look at yourself in the mirror in the morning and say, you know what, I'm enough. I don't need fixing, I don't need improving, I don't need repairing. I, as I am beautiful. I am enough. So I think there are myths around ideas like resilience and growth mindset. There's massive misunderstanding of what does well-being mean. The idea, for instance, that we can teach well-being. And well-being is such an holistic concept. It has component, constituent parts. I think there are myths around that. There are also, I think, problems, misconceptions perhaps, around mental health conditions. So I sometimes hear adults say about your generation that you're always self-diagnosing. You're saying you have anxiety, you're saying you have depression, etc. And adults will often say that these terms are then overused, and then through overuse they lose their meaning. But I wonder whether this is about power, as so many things are. For young people to get a diagnosis, they need to jump over so many hurdles in the first instance. So they need to be listened to, first of all, by their parents, ultimately, and or a really important member of staff within school. They need to be taken seriously, right? And if they're not listened to and not taken seriously, it's not even going to go over that first hurdle. And then that needs to be taken to a referral, and then that maybe will be on a waiting list. And then when the waiting list has actually expired, I might get to see a diagnostician, right? Somebody who's going to tell me, yes, you do have depression, or yes, you do have anxiety. And they probably are an older person. They're probably a man, right? They probably hail from certain demographics. And so we have this idea of gatekeepers. Whereas your generation is so much better informed about mental health and mental ill health that often you can recognize in yourself certain traits, certain characteristics, certain symptoms that make me wonder whether actually it is okay for you not to self-diagnose, because diagnosis resides in a relationship of power, but for you to accept, recognize, perhaps even embrace your depression, your anxiety. So I think that's a really complicated area in the topic of mental health, the idea of gatekeepers and power and stuff, and whether or not you as a generation know more about this and therefore are able to recognize the things in yourself without there being a diagnosis. There also is a massive stigma around mental health in most societies with whom I've worked. The idea that it's okay for me to have a day off because I've got a really bad cold, or maybe to have a few weeks off because I've broken both legs and I can't move around, right? And I'm going to tell you that's the reason why. But what if I get up in the morning and my mental health has been struggling for a while, but actually I can't function? The idea of even taking the duvet off of me and opening my eyes is or feels like an insurmountable challenge. Do I feel able as an adult to call into the school and saying, I'm not well today? Throughout my time in the profession, I know when I started out, teachers would feel that if they called up to say they were not well, they had to put on their not well voice, right? So you'd say, yeah, it's Matthew, I'm really not very well today, right? Whereas if our not wellness is mental, is emotional, we're far less likely to call it in because we worry that it might be judged. And for children, there are stigmas around this that, I talked already about the dismissal of mental ill health by adults, by those in power, and I think that's really, really problematic. But in so many societies, there's also, we're expected to wear masks, right? We're expected to cover up certain things about ourselves because that's just what you're supposed to do. And in each society, there'll be different things we're supposed to cover up, different characteristics, different identities, right? Where it's okay to show, it's not okay to show. You'll experience that within your culture, right? There are certain characteristics, identities it's okay to show and it's not okay to show. And part of that oftentimes is my mental health. And therefore, I'm going to cover it up, right? I think as schools, not your school, I'm sure, ever, right? But schools in general incentivize inauthenticity. They are set up to celebrate conformity and compliance, and therefore to incentivize your appearing that you conform and comply. They're set up to incentivize performance, right? Which is not just academic performance, but performance, you being on your game, you putting in effort to your studies, etc. And so we're incentivizing you putting on a mask that says, I am doing all of those things. So I think that's a real challenge. And I know this is a long answer, but there are so many challenges out there. Another is the myth of there being an either or, an academic either or. Should we be a well-being school or should we be an academic school, right? I've spoken to so many parents, with high expectations of their kids and therefore of the school, who would say to me, yeah, I get well-being, I understand that, but at school I want the focus to be very much on the academics because I want my child to get, the best possible grades. But the idea of it being an either-or is another myth, right? It's a question of priority. There was a business writer, the late great Stephen R. Covey, once said, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And here, I think, if our main thing is academics, then maybe a lot of kids will get really good grades. But it's quite likely a lot of them will become mentally unwell, right? So academics first, mental wellness, mental health is going to wither and deteriorate. We put well-being first. We make sure that children and young people are able to thrive, are their best selves. The academics are going to go through the roof, right? So the idea of an academic either-or, I think, is also a problem. And so much of this arises from lack of education, lack of awareness. And therefore anything that I and you can do to raise awareness of mental ill health, the provenance of it and the consequences of it and how we can remedy it and ameliorate it, I think that has to be a good thing.
Throughout your career, have you encountered any stigmas or misconceptions related to mental health, and how have you used your work as a platform to challenge these?
My mental health journey has been quite complicated. As a child, I was the victim of sexual abuse at the hands of one of my teachers. And also as a child around the same age, whilst in many ways my household was loving, there was also violence in the household. I would hide upstairs doing my academic studies to get the best grades possible, whilst I could hear the screaming, the shouting and the punching downstairs, right? And when we experience trauma as a child or a young person, typically it doesn't manifest when we're a child or a young person. What it does, it seeps down, if I can use an ecological metaphor, it seeps down into our soil. And plants will grow from that soil, oftentimes when we are older, when we're an adult. And that's exactly what happened to me. So as a child, I put on that mask subconsciously. I wasn't aware of kind of the enormity of what had been happening to me. And then as an adult, when I had my own kids, in fact, it felt like everything started to tumble. everything started to emerge, if you like, from that soil. So for much of my adult life, I battled with depression, I battled with suicidality, I have a long-standing battle with self-harm, and this has been my adult life. So I cannot remember a time as an adult when I wasn't fighting these enormous battles behind the scenes without anyone really knowing about them, you know? And I had it in my mind that it was so important not to show anyone any of these things. And so as an educator, as a teacher, as a leader, I never showed to anyone that I was struggling. It all happened behind the scenes. I was admitted to inpatient psychiatric units. I spent a time in a suicide refuge, and I did everything I possibly could to cover these up in a professional setting. And that tussle that lots of us will face, you know, between times of struggle and intense challenge and who we feel we have to be within a certain setting. Sometimes that mask might give us comfort or solace, like at least in this place I can pretend not to be me, right? But I think oftentimes it's a tussle, and it's another battle, right, between the me I think I should be and the me I am. As long as they contradict each other, then I'm never truly going to be happy, right? So, to give an example, as a head teacher, as a principal, I felt I needed to be always happy, always energetic, always strong, always able to solve everyone else's problems. When inside, I was going through life-threatening mental ill health and mental health challenges, right? Now, since leaving headship and going into consultancy, into the role that I do now, I'm trying so hard, and this interview is an example of it, trying so hard to be more open, to be more vulnerable. And I see in that vulnerability strength, and I see in that vulnerability visibility. So I am in positions of power, some of which have been just given to me and some of which I've earned. But I am a white English-speaking man who went to Oxford and has a reasonable amount of money, right? So I inhabit and occupy this place of tremendous power. And therefore I think now I have duty is a difficult word, but I think that if I am talking openly about the fact that, yeah, I've got all that power and have achieved a certain degree of success publicly, but behind the scenes I've been going through hell, I think that's really important. And in terms of how I navigate or overcome these challenges, overcome is a really interesting word. Because in relation to, say, something like self-harm, I regard it as an addiction. And just like an alcoholic will never stop being an alcoholic, I don't think that somebody who's suffered from an eating disorder or periods of self-harm, I don't think they will ever overcome those. They learn to manage those. They learn to recognize the triggers for those. They learn to avoid some of those triggers and fortify themselves against other ones of those triggers. So I don't know if I've overcome them. And navigating them, I mean, I've had a lot of therapy, right? And there's something important in that. Some of it's been good therapy, some of it's been really bad therapy, some of it's therapy I have engaged with, some of it's therapy I haven't engaged with. But the point is, a lot of the best therapy with whom and with which I've engaged has been a safe space where I can speak without any fear of judgment, without any expectation of advice. Someone, well, in your position, I think you should do this, right? Just a safe space where someone will listen to me. And that's been instrumental. But ultimately, it's through all of those experiences, both the trauma and the subsequent trauma on trauma. Because if you think about it, if trauma is in your soil and it manifests or grows later as depression, attempted suicide, self-harm, etc., So in terms of navigating my mental health now, I'm able to do so because of living the trauma of my childhood experience and living the trauma of 20 years of self-harm and suicidality, right? Those have grown in me levels of self-awareness. And therapy has enhanced that self-awareness. So I think now I'm pretty self-aware. But I'm exploring at the moment compassion and specifically self-compassion. I think our ability to care for ourselves is really important, and that's something I'm really, really trying to learn. And then 2.5 years ago, I was thrown another curveball where I developed a really complex neurological disorder which left me paralyzed and unable to use my legs and unable to walk, right? And so just when I got to a point where, mentally I was there. I'd learned to be authentic, I'd learned to manage my mental health. Suddenly I'm given this massive curveball. And there's a model for defining well-being which consists of well-being as a set of scales. Like if my challenges are bigger than my resources, then I'm not going to be okay. My wellness, my mental health are going to struggle. If my resources are bigger than my challenges, then you know what? I'm probably on balance going to be okay, even if my challenges are enormous, right? When I first found that I was unable to walk, I was remarkably upbeat about it because I think I'd developed so many resources that I could manage those challenges. But over 2.5 years, my challenge became bigger and bigger and bigger. Is this going to be forever, right? And then I didn't necessarily have all the resources. So that's been a journey of late as well. So this is a really long answer, but I think all I'm doing here is sharing the fact that, I have a history of mental ill health. But you know what? A large number of the adults in your school will also have their own, it'll be different, but they'll have their own history of mental ill health, their own mental ill health journey. And I'm not saying that all of us as teachers should pour out to you guys as students, children, young people, all of our mental health conditions, right? Because boundaries, yeah? But recognizing that we all have mental health, and therefore we will all at some point in our life have mental ill health, is really important because that removes the stigma, which removes the shame, which enables me to say, this is just like having a broken leg. Now can I seek out the support that will enable me to mend my broken leg?
Can you share any specific challenges you have faced or face in relation to mental health, and how do you navigate or overcome these challenges?
Well, firstly, I should say that this has been a fascinating conversation that we've had. And when I start talking, I do tend to just talk. And I describe this as vulnerability and me showing myself to be vulnerable and to have been vulnerable. But others would misinterpret that perhaps as sharing too much. Some things are best kept closed. Kept hidden. My own 2 adult kids just say I'm oversharing the whole time. But I think it is so important to show that vulnerability. In terms of what you guys can do as a student community, though, and as a school community moving forward, I think lots of the things you do here already are exceptional. And of all the schools I work with, I often talk about founders as really being at that cutting edge. But ultimately, I'd mention a number of things here. Firstly, you have to put well-being first. What I said earlier about the main thing being to keep the main thing, you have to put well-being first. If you don't put well-being first, then well-being will suffer and wither. And bad stuff happens, right? So you've got to absolutely put well-being first. Often as teachers and leaders, we're faced with dilemmas, with questions. Should I do A or should I do B? Should I make decision A or decision B? And I think, well, if we're putting well-being first, what I'm going to do is choose kindness. Which of those 2 decisions is kinder? So that's the first thing I'd say. Secondly, we talked about awareness raising a lot in this conversation. And there are many adults in your school community, inevitably, and I'm not just saying this about your school. There are many adults in your community, and I don't mean this specifically to founders. There are many adults within every school community, right, who don't have the awareness around mental health, who don't have the knowledge, who don't have the understanding. So another tip, and I know you're already treading this road quite boldly, is to ensure that the adults in your community get this. The teachers get this. And the parents get this. So there's a significant parental education piece to this jigsaw, right? Another tip I would give is to focus not just on the well-being of me, but the well-being of us. And I alluded to this earlier on in relation to your question about relationships, yeah? Community well-being. How well is the founders' community as a whole, right? I also think that every child... Well, let me put this another way. There's a TED talk by someone called Rita Pearson entitled "Every Kid Needs a Champion," right? And every child and adult in your school community needs a champion, someone that they trust, even if it's just one person. And until every single child and adult in your school has at least one person they trust to go and talk to if they're struggling, then you've still got a journey to go. And the last point I'd make, for you to sit with and for the listeners to this podcast to absorb, is about soil. I mentioned it earlier in relation to trauma. I think too often schools react to well-being challenges, and they may react really, really well, really expertly, but they react to essentially what is an emergent state. It's the plant that's already burst forth. It's the flowers and the leaves and the blossom that are actually showing themselves. And then if that's healthy, we celebrate it. If that's not healthy, we ride it on horseback and we try and sort it. I don't think schools focus enough on the soil, on that space where all of these problems are coming from. Now, not every mental health challenge that your kids or adults are struggling with come from school, but I don't think schools dig into their soil enough. Is there something about our soil as a community which is playing a role in the mental ill health of some of our students and adults? Because if we can get the soil right, the best farmers and gardeners are not experts in plants, they're experts in soil. So that would be my final tip for the GFS community, is understand your soil. Figure out what the toxins are in it, remove them. Figure out what the nutrients lacking are and put them in. And if you get the soil right, then Founders really will be a school where well-being is everything.
Thank you again to Mr. Matthew for opening the door to such taboo conversations, and thank you to Arman and Jason and Shane for having a wonderful session today as well. And especially I want to thank you guys as well for listening to today's episode, and make sure to stay tuned for the next one as always. Again, we have a lot of figures around school you can always talk to, so please make sure to not bottle up any emotions and to always speak up. This is your host and the Welfare Council, Nyasha Vador, signing out.